Okay, so we talked about the structure of the water molecule, and we also talked about density and how you can change and alter the density of different objects. This is where the two meet. So the structure of water and its ability to form hydrogen bonds, and then how you change density. These two things come into play and to create one of the very, very unique properties of water. And that unique property of water is the fact that water is less dense as a solid than it is as a liquid. So water is actually more dense at 4 degrees Celsius at a liquid than it is at 0 degrees Celsius, which is when it turns to ice and becomes a solid. Why? Well, water molecules are moving when they're in that liquid state. So any atom, any molecule has energy and it's moving. And as water cools down, it loses energy. And as it cools down and loses energy, the water molecules actually start to move closer together. So they move closer together because as they slow down, the attraction from the hydrogen bonds pulls the water molecules closer together. And if you remember, as you decrease the volume, you increase the density. So essentially, when you cool water off and those water molecules move closer together, you are decreasing the volume, which increases the density of a substance. So you are increasing the density of water as you cool it down. Once it reaches a certain point and water starts to actually crystallize and become a solid, the water molecules actually move apart from each other a little bit because they actually have to orient themselves in the proper way because they are polar and they do have charges. And so like charges would repel and opposite charges attract. So when they do form that solid in ice, they will orient themselves in this lattice structure, which you see on the left-hand side of the screen. So the right-hand picture represents the liquid water, where the water molecules are moving around and are closer together than they are in the left-hand picture, which is what water looks like when it's a solid, as ice. So water actually is less dense as a solid than it is as a liquid, which is very, very important actually for things that live in the ocean, especially like fish that live in the ocean. This is important because ice or solid water actually floats. So it floats on the surface of liquid water because it's less dense than liquid water. What this does is it actually allows for ice to form on the surface of the water and to act as like an insulating barrier for all of the water underneath and keeps liquid water underneath the ice. That's important because fish can live in liquid water. We don't want fish frozen solid in ice. So because that ice forms at the top and it floats because it's less dense, it allows for fish to survive through the winter with the ice on the surface of the water. If ice was more dense than liquid water, ice would sink. So anything that's less or more dense than something else will sink. So think of like a piece of lead in a glass of water. That lead is more dense and it sinks. If anything is less dense than something else, it will float. So think of like oil and water. Oil is less dense than water, so it floats on the top. If ice was more dense than liquid water, ice would form at the top of the water, and it would become more dense. It would be more dense than the liquid water underneath, and it would sink all the way to the bottom. So you get like a layer of ice that would form, and then that layer would sink to the bottom. And that would leave liquid water at the top, which then could freeze again, form another layer of ice, and sink down again, and leave more liquid water up at the top, and that would freeze and sink down. So eventually what you would get is the entire ocean, or the places where it got cold enough, it would sink or freeze completely through, and the fish that are there, that live there, would die because they'd be frozen in ice. So the fact that ice floats actually allows for liquid water to remain and for fishies to be happy and to survive the winter in the water that's underneath that ice. Another reason why it's important that water will actually get more dense up until 4 degrees Celsius and then it will become less dense is that when it becomes more dense, it sinks to the bottom. So if you get surface water at the top that becomes more dense, it sinks down. And as it sinks down, it takes all of the oxygen that's up there in the surface waters and brings it down to the deep. And that's actually how we get oxygen from the surface to the animals that live in the deep sea. That's how they get their oxygen and are able to survive. So water and density actually are very, very important for things that live in the ocean.